Welcome. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Lozier, and I am the Associate Director in the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome each of you for this special edition reunion back to school class featuring Charlie Skinner, class of 1969. Before we get started, I want to go over a few Zoom keeping items. First of all, participants have been muted and we ask that you remain muted throughout the event. If you are comfortable and have not changed your Zoom name to your first and last name, we ask that you do so now. You can rename yourself by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen, hovering your mouse over your name, and then clicking the more button. Feel free to add your Davidson class here if you have one as well. The chat feature will be available. If you have questions for Charlie, please utilize the Q&A button. Charlie will not be monitoring the chat, so please do not send questions directly to him. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end. For optimal viewing, we recommend hovering your mouse at the top of the black Zoom screen where you will see view pop up. If you click on that and then select side-by-side speaker view, you will be able to see the speaker in full view. In addition, we have enabled live audio transcription for this call. If you would like to enable this on your end, you can hover over the live transcription button on your screen and subtitles should appear. Please note that the captions are not always accurate, so we ask for your grace and understanding. If you do have a tech issue, please send a chat to myself so we can take care of that for you. Now for our speaker. Charles Skinner worked at the Center of Policy Making at the U.S. State Department, German Foreign Office, U.S. embassies to Yugoslavia, Germany, NATO, and Britain, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the Balkan Wars, 9/11, and Iraq. After retiring from the Foreign Service, he taught graduate courses at Pitt on NATO, on foreign policy and diplomacy, and on international history for 12 years. He graduated from Davidson in 1969, JYA Marburg from 1967 to 1968, served in the U.S. Army from 1970 to 72, and earned a PhD in modern European history at Harvard in 1979. The Alumni Association presented him with the Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2019. He is currently working on a number of books, including one on working with allies. Please help me welcome Charlie.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. When Luther Moore asked me if I would be willing to give an online class in the run-up to our reunion, he suggested I talk about the mess we are in. Mess is, of course, a technical term, and we're always in a mess, but I think that we are in a particularly bad one right now. Eisenhower, you may recall, used to think one thing you could do about problems was ignore them because a lot of them would go away. But I'm not sure some of these are going to go away. So I think it's worth trying to think about it. The other context I wanted to lay out was that we are at a point in the cycle of our domestic politics where presidential elections are on the agenda. And for the bureaucracy, this means that everybody is working on preparing for the new term, whether the current incumbent gets reelected or a rival. Summaries of where things stand and what approaches have been. Usually we got to write these 3 times, one for the outgoing team, one for the bureaucracy in between, and then one for the new team as they came on board. Right now, of course, there are also think tanks out there, which are also trying to position themselves to put forward experts who would work on some of the current problems and producing summaries. For example, right now, the Heritage Foundation is doing exactly that with an eye to another Trump presidency. So in some ways, you might look at this talk as part of that process. What I'm going to talk about briefly is start with a sort of historical parallel. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about what is involved in policymaking. Then I'm going to share a realist's analysis. I happen to have had the good fortune to hear one of the great public intellectuals of our era give his analysis a few weeks ago at Duquesne University here in Pittsburgh. And then I'm going to talk about what I think we should be focusing on. First, talking about the three key points, Russia, the Middle East, and China, but also then developing more of a global agenda that would look at briefly at the rest of the world, talk about then the process of working with allies and partners. Actually, we spend a lot of our time just talking to the people who are usually on our same wavelength dealing with problems. And finally, I want to talk about some ideas about improving the machinery of government and the interface with the domestic situation. And at the end, I will come back with a few sort of key points that I've talked about in the session, because we cover a lot of territory, so it'll be easy to forget some things, and that may help you with questions. I've clocked it and it takes about 3 hours, so don't worry, we'll be done in no time. If you want to think about where we are today, and I know that historical parallels are never exact, to me it seems like we're a lot like the situation of the United States in May of 1940. And most of you know exactly what was going on in May of 1940, but in case it slipped your memory a little bit, that was the point at which France was defeated by Germany in the Second World War. And you see, our situation was that we, like the French, had been hiding behind the Maginot Line. We had a navy to deal with Japan. We were counting on the Royal Navy to deal with any German problems, but our experts figured the British would not last very long. So we only really had half the Navy we needed. As for an army, well, the army was about the size of a Balkan nation's army. So we weren't ready for that. And I think in a lot of ways, we're in that situation today. We are telling ourselves that these problems are all far away and they can't come get us. But these are pretty serious problems. You might argue, I think the Europeans would argue, this is the most serious problem since the Second World War, and we should take it very seriously. So, moving on to just briefly talk about what is involved in policymaking and what I would teach my students at Pitt when I taught courses on foreign policy and diplomacy. The key thing, I think, that people always forget about is you need to identify what your goal is, where it is you want to go. Sometimes it seems pretty obvious. Japan attacks our fleet at Pearl Harbor. What do? Well, in some ways, we didn't have a choice. We were at war. We didn't need to declare war. It had been declared on us. But still, it seems to me it's very good to try to define where you would like to end up. And I bet if you put this challenge to me at the end of our talk, you'll say, well, you didn't quite lay out all of that in the detail we need. The second thing you really need to pay attention to is intelligence, what you know. Don Rumsfeld used to say, of course, it's not what you know, what you don't know, and what you don't know that you're not even worried about, because you're not even thinking of it. And there are many cases where we have a pretty good picture of what's going on, but we think, oh, Putin would never do that. Our European allies were in very much that situation at the beginning of the current phase of the war in Ukraine. They thought it was a stupid thing to do, and it was. But you can't rule out the possibility that another player will do something stupid. And the classic case of that is Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War, where there was one CIA analyst who thought that Saddam would invade. Everybody else thought that was a stupid thing to do and he shouldn't do it. And of course, that analyst then, of course, became legendary over time. Anyway, if you look at our current agenda and you look at the president's State of the Nation speech, State of the Union speech, you will see he mentioned three foreign policy problems: Russia, China, and the Middle East. So I will talk about those. Those are the ones that John Mearsheimer talked about at Duquesne University when he talked on March 11th about America's troubled foreign policy. And then I will do what the bureaucracy does. I will try to take a larger view of the global situation, and really for two reasons. One is, I think, the danger of the realist approach is it tends to be too narrow, and it doesn't prepare you for the other problems that you will find yourself facing, and you had better be in as good a position you can be to get there. So anyway, turning to the realist analysis. Realism looks at threats, what are the dangers? And of course, the threat could be a pandemic, but it tends to be the potential threat of a military force against yours. And then it looks at power. In other words, your ability to handle those threats. Now, in foreign policy terms, we have true traditions in the United States. The realist is one. And if you read chapter 2 of Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, you know he lays out these two theories. The other side was the one that is identified with Woodrow Wilson, that Davidson alum. And the usual term that political scientists use for that is liberal. I prefer talking about it as idealist, as being different from realist. But in some ways, you could say the US policy today is defined in Wilsonian terms, because we're talking about preserving the rules-based order. In other words, you set up a sort of international legal framework for how nations should conduct their relations. And that framework is laid out in the UN Charter. And that is the criteria used for policy. There are, besides those other threats that I talk about and those other powers, there are threats like terrorism, which is a non-state threat of force. But there are other things. I already mentioned the pandemic. That's, of course, a biological threat. There's the environment, global warming. And I would say there's also the economic threat. There's a threat of a bad turn in the economy. And those are all issues that I think our government will be looking at as we go through this political cycle. Realists have, I can think of two realist approach to the current situation. One was articulated a couple of years ago by another Davidson alum, Graham Allison, who used to talk about Dr. Laban's Greek classes. And he is famous for emphasizing in our relations with China what he calls the Thucydides trap. And that is that a rising power is almost predestined to go to war with the leading power of the age. And so he's looking at China and the United States. He argues, in fact, in his book that it doesn't always happen. It didn't happen when we replaced Britain as the leading power in the world. And he looks at those cases particularly because he says you need to look at those because they give you clues about how you can avoid it. But he's basically saying that we should think that war with China is really quite likely. Mearsheimer's analysis to the Duquesne students is sort of a riff on that. He's saying, in fact, we need to pay attention to that point. China is the only peer rival that the United States has. It is the biggest threat to us. China should be our goal. And in fact, what we should do is we should try to get the other power that's in play, Russia, on our side. He said further, Russia is going to win the war in Ukraine. It has a bigger population and more artillery. It's going to win, and we should face it. He said we should have faced it before we went to war. And in fact, he's even argued we're somewhat responsible for the war by our policy. I think that's wrong, but that's his position. He looks at the world today and says there are 4 flashpoints for war in both Europe and in the Far East. In Europe, it's the Black Sea, where you've already seen some play back and forth between Ukraine and Russia. And of course, there are other countries that are in the Black Sea. Moldova, which, in case you don't have your map at hand, is between Ukraine and Romania. But there's a significant Russian population there and some Russian units there. So it could easily turn into a little war. Then there's the Baltic Sea, which is almost a NATO lake, except for the Kaliningrad Oblast between Poland and Lithuania, and also, of course, St. Petersburg's outlet to the sea. And finally, he would say the Arctic Ocean, which is the ice cap is melting. It's got 7 NATO countries on it, but also, of course, for about half of it, Russia. He argues that during the Cold War, war in Europe would have been so disastrous that it really was a great deterrent. But he asked the question, would a war in either of these 4 places trigger the same deterrent effect? So he's basically saying we're closer to going to war. If war starts between us and the Russians, or in the Far East between us and the Chinese in the 4 points. And in the Far East, the 4 flashpoints he identifies are Taiwan, of course, which has been in the news in part because of the election there, but also the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and of course, Korea, where we have had an experience of going to war. And in fact, this is probably too old even for the class of '69 to remember. The Chinese came into that war, and both we and the Chinese lost tens of thousands of people in that war. And the Chinese maybe even hundreds of thousands of people. So it is part of their memory. Anyway, I understand what Mearsheimer is doing, and I think it's an important critique for us to keep priorities in our mind as we do, but policy tends to react to problems. We do tend to react to the most immediate problem, the most recent problem, or one like Putin's war in Ukraine that is active and has the potential of creating a major change. And I think you could argue that a defeat of Ukraine would call into question a lot of things. One is the reliability of the NATO alliance, the potential there for Putin to then attack the next country and dare NATO to do something about it, having had a successful war in Ukraine against NATO weaponry. And some of the targets being significantly smaller, like the Baltic states. Um, but I think I would take my cue for policy making more from the pandemic and the environment. I think the world faces problems that are bigger than any of the capabilities, and that none of the powers, neither the United States nor China, neither not the United States in our unipolar moment, was capable of solving all the world's problems. The problems are just too big. After all, we could not completely pacify Afghanistan or Iraq. Um, and in that unipolar moment. And there are lots of other things. I think countries should not delude themselves that they can run everything. The world it's gotten smaller, but it's also gotten bigger and more complex. And we have to keep in mind uh, these variables. Population is one. We're only 4% of the global population. China and India are each 17%. We're number three. We probably don't even think about who the other top 10 countries are. Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Brazil. All of these have more than 200 million people. These are huge countries. Wealth is another member. The US is about a quarter of the 100 trillion global GDP. The EU has about 19 trillion, a little more than 19 trillion. China has about 18 trillion. And the other key countries are smaller, but again, the capability of even these wealthier countries of managing the global economy is really quite limited. I would also argue that we all suffer from what you might call regional myopia. We tend to be concerned about our immediate neighborhood. I think that's true of China. I think that's true of Russia, which keeps talking about its near abroad. And I think it's true of the United States when we talk about immigration on our southern border. I mean, in some ways, and I thought this was an interesting point that Mearsheimer made when somebody did bring it up. He said, we're the only country that can deal with immigration. And in fact, China and Russia have declining populations because of their age profile. Whereas for us, we have an advantage of an ability to absorb other people and keep an age profile that is growing. But I mentioned the regional myopia because if I'm going to argue that we should have a global approach and we should try to bring a lot of other countries into a global effort, we have to remember that everybody is going to have a regional focus, and to some extent we do too, when we talk about things like our southern border or this hemisphere. So what do we do about Russia? What do we do about the Middle East? What do we do about China? And then how does this fit with my argument that we should really try to articulate a global agenda? Our position with Russia on the Ukraine war has been fairly clear from the beginning, and that is that Russia should commit its commitments under the UN Charter and the Budapest Memorandum to recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine and withdraw. But I think that the other dimension of our approach to Russia should be very much like the NATO approach to Russia during the Cold War, where we pursued what was called a double track approach to the Russian deployment of missiles, intermediate range missiles that could target our European allies, thus trying to drive a wedge between us and them. our European allies, and this was really their idea, said, we will accept the deployment of your intermediate range missiles, but we also want to have a diplomatic channel to negotiate. We need, I think, to do a similar thing. And to some extent, I think the West has a great advantage in that, given our democratic political system, we're used to having two different ideas in our minds at one time about where we would go. But I think we should try to articulate to Russia what an outcome would be like. And I think that outcome, to some extent, we have already had a dry run at in the years after the Cold War. We've tried to deal with the differences in arms. We've tried to find a role for Russia in the councils, and we've done that. We did that in the Balkans with the Russians participating in what was called the contact group with the other great powers, Britain, France, Germany. And at the beginning, it was Spain, because Spain had the EU presidency. Then Italy argued, well, look, most of what we do in the Balkans, we're going to be your platform. We should be a participant. And they had their turn at the EU presidency. And then we brought in the EU presidency as well. But in other words, a small group of Western countries sitting down with the Russians to talk about what to do in the Balkans. That continued even into the Kosovo phase, when we had a sharper disagreement with the Russians. So the possibility of some sort of forum to participate would be out there. And let me jump ahead to the end to what I wanted to say about working with allies. To some extent, from that era and even more recently, in more recent presidents, we've developed a capability for our president to sit down with key allied leaders, even in a secure environment, to have a discussion. So the ability of Western leaders to participate in a dialogue with each other has become really quite good. And in fact, the challenge of diplomacy is to fill in the space from the top all the way down. But I'm getting ahead there. But I think, we could be prepared to offer Russia, and China for that matter, that kind of informal small group discussion of as either ad hoc with issues or on a more formal basis to deal with things. The trouble that Russia always had in NATO-Russia meetings was it hated to be in a meeting where it would be lectured to by Luxembourg. And, sitting in the back row, I felt like saying, hey, we do this all the time, every day here at NATO. We get lectured to by Luxembourg and all these other small countries. But anyway, where that goes is in some ways, as I said, the hard part. But I think there are always enough problems for everybody to work on if you're serious about doing it. But you have to bring a certain amount of energy, which means resources and readiness to put into solving whatever the problem is. So specifically, the one thing, though, that I think we have been very weak on, and the Russians have been extraordinarily successful, is on the information war. We have a history of Radio Free Europe, and before that, there was the British BBC during the Second World War, and of course, Radio Liberty, which was aimed at Russia. You would think in today's world of social media, we would we would be more successful at letting the Russian population know what's going on. But they have successfully replaced almost all of the Western platforms except YouTube for their population to turn to. And I do think that's something we have been ineffective as, whereas at the same time, the Russians have been very effective. And a couple of senior Republican leaders in the House of Representatives made this point yesterday, that a number of things that Republicans in Congress are saying are exactly what the Russians are asking them to say. They're very effective at putting their points out, and particularly effective in the American style of political polarization. Well, I'll come back to Russia in the sort of global roundup at the end, but let me move on to the Middle East. For the news media, of course, the Middle East has been this war provoked by Hamas. So it's a war provoked by a terrorist organization against the state of Israel. And to understand it, you have to, it seems to me, you have to understand the whole region and its history, which is very complex. And of course, if you get involved in those negotiations, you realize the people who are involved in them have lived with them. So they know them for decades. And they know each other for decades. So it's a very difficult environment to negotiate in. And it's a very complex one. And you have to break down all of the different conflicts in all of the different parts of the Middle East. And it's very hard to generalize. It's very hard to have a coherent policy that would address all of the parts to it. In my classes, I tended to start with the end of the 19th century, where the region was generally in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had what was called a millet system, which asked each community to manage its own affairs, and then they would manage disputes among the communities. The balances were adjusted because people were thrown out of Russia, particularly the areas where there were many Jews, following an assassination of a Russian czar. Most of the Jews that left the Russian Empire there came to the United States, but some of them went to Central Europe, mostly to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But some also went to the Ottoman Empire. And in these various waves of settlement that came out, I think this tragedy was a relationship between this community and the community there never really developed. So you can say that the separation was there, but the real conflict that we see today between Palestinians and Israelis is something that has only developed over decades. At the beginning, a lot of people start with the Balfour Declaration, which was when the British cabinet promised a home to the Jewish people. Britain was at war with the Ottomans, so it was trying to win that war. Britain was of the major allies, it was the one most present. The other ally had some ambitions in that area was France. So the British struck an agreement with the French about the division of the area, this famous Sykes-Picot region. They struck the Balfour Agreement with the Zionists. Zionist headquarters were in Berlin, and they didn't want the Zionists to side with Germany and the Ottomans. And they also struck a deal with the Hashemite family, which was ruling the western part of the Arabian Peninsula under the Ottoman Empire. And we Americans tend to know those people most from Lawrence of Arabia. But the British also had a war effort based not just in Egypt, where they had, since the Suez Canal, they had sort of a base, but from India, where there was an Anglo-Indian base. And it was the Anglo-Indian forces that fought the war in what we generally call the Persian Gulf. And they tended to side with the Saudi family. So the British had two competing regimes, and both of them, of course, are still with us in that area. The Hashemites in Jordan, and the Saudis now rule all of that. Anyway, it's a very complex history, and I think the short version of my approach is that we need to, I think, in concert with the rest of the world, try to put a certain amount of pressure on the Middle East to address all of their problems themselves and support them. And I think we have potential allies. I think you probably think I'm crazy, but I would say try to get India and Pakistan to supply um, peacekeeping forces if they were needed in the region. Um, Indians have a pretty good relationship with the Israelis, for example, but you also have to remember that India is the fourth largest Muslim nation in the world, so they have their own Muslims who they can work with. Anyway, they have their own problems there too. But anyway, I think um, the other dimension to this, with regard specifically to the current fighting, is that the United States, almost from the beginning of our taking over as a key outside power, particularly in relation with Israel, is our position has been to support a two-state solution. And you heard this from President Biden at the beginning of it. The thing is that Netanyahu's ally at avoiding the two-state solution had been Hamas. His problem was with Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. So to some extent, Netanyahu was caught by surprise by somebody who was in some ways on his same wavelength, trying to avoid a two-state solution. And of course, Hamas wanted to avoid it for reasons differently from Netanyahu's, but it made them allies. I do think it's going to be a hard way to go. It will take a long time, but I still think that is the best approach, and the usual approach is a slow, step-by-step process. But I do think it will require much more active engagement on our part, which of course Americans in some ways have no taste for another mission in the Middle East. Finally, with regard to China, let me say we are at a difficult position right now. As you may have seen, Tony Blinken has told our NATO allies that China has been supplying military capabilities that have been helping the Russians. In some ways, China gave Putin a green light, and you can ask yourself now, why is China doing what it's doing? Is it just wanting Russia and the West to be preoccupied with themselves? Is he helping Russia because he thought Russia was losing, or does he want Russia to win against us? It's hard to say, but I do think it would be good to call them out on that. The Chinese don't like being made responsible for bad things. But I think the problem with Mearsheimer's realist approach to trying to deal with China through the Cold War tactic of containment won't succeed, because while today most people look at China as having moved from an era of engagement with the West to an era of great power competition, I wouldn't say that that's wrong, but you can't say it's no longer economic. And I think you have to try to play the economic possibilities against the dangers of war. You know, the problem with going to war is the minute you go to war, you've lost control of what's going on. And I would like to think that the Chinese have learned that lesson from Putin, even if they didn't realize it before. But you know, you're not going to be the only actor in a war. It's just not going to be that way. And so Deng Xiaoping's advice was a peaceful rise, and I think that's still good advice. But one does worry. We have to recognize China has played a positive role in the world economy. When we were in danger of another depression, a lot of arguments is that we prevented that with our wall of money uh, printed by the Fed. But you also have to realize that about half the problem was handled by China, taking a Keynesian approach, having governments spend a lot of money and keeping part of the world's economy going. I think the Chinese approach to other parts of the world have not been as successful as they might, but I think we have to recognize that China is a major player in those other parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and we need to take that into account in a larger approach. Well, I've realized I'm going on much too long, but just briefly, I would say we should not ignore the rest of the world, the global South. That's not a good concept. I would argue we need to develop good relations with some of the major countries, India in the South, which in part we're already doing, with Nigeria in Africa, with Brazil in Latin America, and also I think with Mexico. Besides sharing a border with Mexico and Mexico being a big country, I think Mexico has a unique problem of its interface with crime in the United States. And I think that needs to be a priority. And in some ways, Mexico as a neighbor is always going to be a priority. But I would like to use those good relations with those to try to develop, position ourselves with all of those big parts of the world where we were better placed in the future. And finally, I would say we need to lay this whole thing out. When Wilson went into the First World War, he had his 14 points. When we went into the Second World War, FDR and Roosevelt and Churchill had negotiated the Atlantic Charter, which sort of rolls over fairly seamlessly into the UN Charter. I think we need to lay out a vision for the world. I think the world's got enough problems that it could use a little direction about where we want to go in dealing with these problems. We have a lot of tools out there that are partly the result of the world we've lived in. NATO is, of course, the most famous, just celebrating its 75th anniversary. As you will see as we go to the summit, what we do with NATO will be part of our vision. NATO has worked with countries in Afghanistan as part of this global thing. So there are elements out there, and I think we need to crank up all of these international organizations. Some are UN, some haven't been developed. I'm sure the robots have already got something going, and we need to play catch up. Anyway, to be serious, let me going to the end. I think there are two other things I want to say about the future. I think we really need to develop the tools that we deal with, specifically the Foreign Service. And I think the same thing would apply by just naturally to other parts of the government and to congressional staffers. And I know that I know the people at Harvard or some of the people at Harvard are working on how to do this. But my own view is that US diplomats don't have the training that they need to work in the world. We tend to work in just a couple of regions, but we need to have a view of the whole world because the whole world is present everywhere. And we need more training as we go along. We are good at languages. We need to be better. And I think we need to stop appointing donors to campaigns to major embassies. we need to have professional embassies. If I look at the people I worked with when I was at the State Department, and when I was overseas at our embassies in Germany, Britain, and at NATO, a lot of these people were later the national security advisors of their country. Britain's national security advisor right now, Tim Barrow, Sir Tim, was a person I dealt with day in and day out on US EU relations. American diplomats can't aspire to a position like that. And that means we are not going to be the kind of advisors, that professional advisors on this, that our presidents need. And the same thing is true. I think staffers need to get the same sort of training to work with Congress. We live in an age where expertise is dismissed, but it is needed, desperately needed, to deal with these complex problems in a novel around the world. And finally, I would say we need to go back to the Cold War practice of politics stopping at the border. We cannot be effective if major foreign policy issues are held hostage in the House of Representatives by people using lines used by one of the major combatants. Anyway, so I think I've moved fast enough. I won't review all the things that I said, but I just wanted to come back to my place. I started with France in 1940. At the end, we did have the effectiveness of people on both sides of the aisle working for us. In some ways, I think they were better off. Who ran against FDR in 1940? It was Wendell Willkie, who got positioned, got nominated by the Republicans as somebody who was engaged in the world. And who did FDR have appoint? He appointed Hoover's Secretary of State and Taft's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, to be his Secretary of War. And he appointed the person who ran against him as Vice President in 1936 to be his Secretary of the Navy. And of course, Truman had an Arthur Vandenberg, a Republican partner in the founding of NATO. So I think, I think in some ways we're not as well positioned as FDR was. And he was very clever about maneuvering us to get ready for the war. You can't snap your fingers and be ready for war. And I don't think we're ready. Anyway, I'll leave you with those happy thoughts. And I will be glad to try to tackle any question you want to throw at me.
Charlie, we did have someone posted, Tom Engel posted, apologies, Tom, if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly. He wanted to know, what are the prospects for a global agenda when the U.S. is increasingly isolationalist and one party tells U.S. citizens that globalist is a dirty word?
It's a very good question. I think it will be hard. I do think, I realize in the current environment, of course, it would tend to be politics. But I think you start with something, just as Roosevelt and Churchill did, and then you let other people work at it. It's good if it could be as short as the Atlantic Charter, and I think that would be the advantage. If you even the UN Charter is, if you look at it, looks good compared to some of the major documents the EU has turned out. It's very hard, but I do think it is a challenge to try to look at the problems that we face in the world and talk and give ourselves goals to work for, and argue that just as we did in the pandemic, we didn't know how to solve this problem, and we, science gave us sort of a running start at it, but we didn't know the solutions. But I don't think there's anything wrong at identifying a problem and saying we need to tackle it. And if some people say, well, we need to start at home, start. And do it. But I think it would be easier in some ways to develop a global agenda and recognize that just as in the pandemic, there are some people who are going to say, well, this is a figment of somebody's imagination and I'm not going to wear any mask. That's the world. That's the way it exists and the way we have to deal with it. And there are always going to be interested parties, so you can form a smaller contact group that would sort of take the lead in dealing with problems. But I think we need to transition to a mode where you can't just hold your breath in City Hall or in the House of Representatives and think that'll make problems go away.
Thank you, Charlie. We do have some time. If anyone else would like to ask Charlie a question, feel free to take yourself off mute. Or you can type your question in the chat and I will read it to Charlie.
So my question is, who are all these old people on this film, on these pictures?
I can't recognize any of them,
including you.
I have a question for Charlie on Ukraine, and why don't we take the frozen Russian assets to fund the defense of Ukraine if, as is the case now, the House of Representatives is incapable of doing anything?
Well, since you sent me an email about this question, Phil, I could have researched it. One of the students I knew at Harvard, one of the undergraduates, has been legal advisor to the State Department and is a major lawyer who's worked on this issue. And certainly in conjunction with wars in the past, as I mentioned, the French had to pay the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, and the Germans had to pay the Allies after the First World War. And certainly the Soviets took lots of things back home after the Second World War. I think it seems like a no-brainer that if a country is destroying things in another country in a war that the world views as unjust, and not, I mean, I think the US military would argue we have tried to, target specific things, but sometimes we do hit other people, and sometimes we've paid compensation for mistakes and so on like that. So and you're more of a lawyer than I am, Phil, so you can look at the legal. I'm sure Americans look at this and wonder about, are people going to come with a long list of charges they want for things we should pay for that we broke? But I do think in this case, it seems like a natural sense of, and it is a way to target Russia, which has built up large amount of savings to run with its war. But I do think the other part of that question is, think about what is the result if Ukraine loses, and we start looking for people to blame. I think the Speaker of the House of Representatives will be very high on a lot of people's list.
Mm-hmm.
And I think losing that war would be the biggest blow to transatlantic relations. So it's not just losing to Russia. I mean, besides what that would mean. It's one thing to walk out of Afghanistan after winning the war for 20 years, but it's another thing to lose. But I think our relations with Europe would really suffer.
Okay, a quick follow-up question. You mentioned that the Russian information is being parroted by House Republicans. Do you have any idea whether Russia is funding folks like this woman in Georgia, Taylor Greene, who is trying to have the House Speaker deposed because of the Ukraine funding issue? I mean, it seems to me that Russia is funding some folks, because I don't see how a reasonable person could do something that these are Taylor Greene woman is parroting.
I haven't looked into that, Phil. I couldn't really.
Okay.
Charlie, I'm gonna go ahead and ask the final question. I do want to add that if anyone wants to ask Charlie additional questions, I am going to put my email address in the chat, and feel free to reach out to me via email and send me those questions, and I will get them to Charlie. Sam Tallman, Charlie wanted to know, in the Middle East, what players might find their strategic future most closely with the United States?
Oh, well, I tend to think in the Middle East, with some obvious exceptions, I think most people will talk to the United States. At the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a think tank fellow who wrote a book trying to remind us that Iran wasn't a political monolith and that there were possibilities there. And I think Obama was very interested in perhaps trying to exploit that opportunity. But then in the Iranian elections, that route got closed, and so the possibility wasn't there. So what I'm trying to say is, I think even in countries that have been, or at least some actors in some countries have been fairly hostile, like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, it's not as if there wouldn't be somebody to talk to. But I mean, I think as we found, we became the key interlocutor in the Middle East after the Yom Kippur War, and we still have the advantage of being the best interlocutor for Israel. But anybody who thinks we can get Israel to do what we want hasn't been paying attention. I mean, we're not able to do it. Certainly, other countries, if you said to them, okay, Denmark, can you get Israel to, or we're counting on you to get Israel to do this? It's very hard. I think it's very clear, and you've seen diplomacy conducted this way, to find middle people to do a lot of the negotiating. So I think diplomacy has evolved so that there are enough players out there that you can get anything talked about. You can raise any trial balloon and get that out in play. Whether you can reach the end is hard to do, but the tool is usually to set create an event and try to get everything done in preparation for that, whether it's a NATO summit or an EU summit or whatever kind of meeting that is a forcing event.
Well, Charlie, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us today and leading us in this conversation. I also wanted to extend a big thank you to the Class of 1969 Reunion Committee for sponsoring this event. Do note that this event was recorded and will be available on our website in about 2 weeks. Finally, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Take care, and we hope to see you at Reunion in May.